What's up guys, welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about adding detail to your builds, attacking the flat space. I'm going to start off by giving you some cookie cutter patterns and block shapes that you can use on basically anything to make the spaces more interesting, and then we'll go through some large grid and small grid examples showing those patterns in use and how you can set them up. So to start off, let's answer the question, what is detail? What causes something to look interesting? And in this game, detail is adding contrast. The three big ways that you can add contrast is to create a difference in color, you can create a difference in texture, or you can create a difference in depth. If you combine more than one of them, then that gives you usually an even better effect. And what you're after is something that creates an interesting look while still blending in well enough to not distract from the overall shape of the surface you put it on. So this is I guess you could call it a catalog of detail that I basically came up with them as I moved along, so I do apologize for the way that they're grouped. They probably could have been organized a little bit better, but as the ideas came to me on things that I've used, I just put them down. So we're going to go through all of these pretty quickly, showing what block is used and why it's good. Starting off with basically the MVP of the game is the blast door. And the reason that this one is so good is because color, it's usually darker than the blocks around it. Obviously you could change the color. The texture is extremely smooth and uniform, so that creates nice contrast. And then the depth. So this is the only block that has this minor depth difference. And it's subtle enough that it doesn't jump out at you, say as much as like a half block. But it's still noticeable to create this small shadow around the edge, and that's basically what makes it the most valuable one in your arsenal. It combines all three, color, texture, and depth into one, and then as a fourth added bonus, it will increase the armor value of whatever surface you place it on. And so what I started off with was these smooth shape blocks that you can use as kind of floor walkways. You can use them as landing pads. Right here we have the side of a passageway block, and it has this uniform shape with just this single panel in the middle. That does look nice. The top of the passageway block has an even better uniform shape, very flat, very nice. This one's pretty classic. The interior wall block, the top part of it, has a great tiled look. I've seen this used on many walkways. And then we have the sci-fi interior wall blocks. So this is I'll call it the top of them because it has this uniform look. And then it also has a different texture on all 5 of its sides, so that you can basically pick and choose what kind of detail you want to add. I've gotten a lot of use out of this side with the caution stripe, just to designate the start of something, like a landing pad. Over here we have half blocks, and then the 2x1 slope that you can use to blend into a half block, creating great depth. You'll pick that up from far away. Depth like this, and then using negative space. This works well on lightly colored blocks because you get that high contrast with the shadow. And then these half block corners, relatively newer to the game, they create the same effect but not quite as drastic as the 2x1. So I've gotten a lot of use out of those. Obviously you can go with just adding half blocks on top of your shape. Definitely a good plan. Creating that basically coming out of the surface effect will always look nice. Spotlights being used as a stack to look like tubing. I have been using this one a lot, and Really, I think it's the best tube that we have in the game right now. I'll get to the tires in a second, but if you want to be able to color the tube, this is pretty much the best option I can see. We have parachute blocks, the sides of which have a great just little, industrial piping, little brackets and recess space. So those can look nice if you just want to give it a better look. And then pretty classic, the interior wall, once again, using the side of it, using the pipes, and even the emissive texture of the lights can be good. You can put them behind these catwalks for an even better effect, or just use the catwalks by themselves. And then moving on over here, this is the side of a shower, and if you can embed the shower in on the other sides, then you just get to use this nice panel. This is another side of the shower for a different shape, and then this one is an armory, which I have used on a few gates before. Moving on to the next one, tires. Everybody knows about tires, but they're usually better for small grid, especially if you want to use them as kind of a tubing effect. Then the treads can get lost when you use them in small grid. So we'll see examples of that. And then grinding them down, obviously. You can find good uses for this. Sometimes it's a little too shiny to blend in well enough. This one's one of my favorites. If you use opposing ion thrusters, obviously you want to turn them off so they don't damage each other, but this can make a great looking power source kind of thing, which we will see. Moving on to more versions of the blast door, using the corners and sides. You can create some great looking shapes out of those. Once again, large or small blocks, just to create little gaps, better detail. It can make structures look like they're much better enforced, or gates, as you can see on this one. Vertical windows, going for that texture contrast, and it's even better if you can get a block behind it that also has maybe some emissive or light or something to brighten it up. This one is the backside of some lockers, which can also has a nice flat, interesting textured surface. And then moving on to the backside of LCDs. This one I haven't been able to use a ton, but when it does come into play, it makes a really nice effect. There's really nothing else in the game that has quite the same kind of pattern that these ones have. The next couple is just making use of the negative space in blocks and just using corners to create interesting shapes that your eyes get drawn to. Once again, these work best with light colored armor so that you get the shadow contrast. And then moving on, these 2x1 corners, the fat part of them, are really valuable. Probably the second place as opposed to the blast doors. But if you put them in a row, kind of like this, it makes a really nice venting effect. I've used it this way, but using it this way, especially on small grids, this has a fantastic look to it that you could add basically to anything, and it'll fit right in. Not to be left out, we've got curved blocks to make, once again, bigger tubing. If you can find a space to embed that into the side, definitely an eye catcher. Or you can stack them just like these to create a venting effect with a little more curve to it. And then we have beacons. I haven't seen these used as much as I think they should be, but if you need to, you can stack them together obviously, but to fill up 2 blocks in a kind of rectangular fashion, it looks better in my opinion the small grid version. I use them a lot inside of the legs of walkers just to look like, you know, components, things that are supposed to be controlling the movements. So really good little one right there. A couple version of the catwalks. You can use this one just to create a very tiny amount of depth, but obviously some texture contrast. And then if you use the walls, these can look kind of like some heat radiators, and it does have a nice interesting look to it. I've used it on stations before where it just looks like once again those heat radiators going from top to bottom. Moving along, we've got the interior pillar, and this one looks great when you use it as a support structure between blocks that are extended, or you can even embed them into the armor like this. And then the last one is going to be ore detectors, taking advantage of the fact that they have a circular shape, which not many blocks in the game do. And then they have these nice panels going around the outside that are very fun to look at. So now that we've seen the different patterns available, let's take a look at how they can be incorporated into your build. And all of these were built before DLC was even added to the game. I didn't mention a lot of DLC blocks, so if you haven't bought any, this will still be pretty applicable. And your bread and butter for most of this detail is going to be interior walls, blast doors, vertical windows, and catwalks and interior pillars. You'll see those ones coming up again and again and again. So with this first one, what I wanted to highlight is really just the use of color. What I've got here is 4 different shades of tan, and I've put them together pretty randomly, but making sure that they always connect in a horizontal fashion and never vertical. And the effect that this has is kind of a brick, kind of tile laying pattern that just makes the whole thing look better without really doing much to the flat space. Your eye is just drawn all over to how these tiles connect to each other. Moving over to here, on the base of this tower, starting out, we can see these blast doors used, really trying to accentuate this long part of the tower. Instead of using patterns that go opposite of where the length is, I really tried to accentuate the height of it. And so just using the blast doors to outline normal blocks in the middle gives this effect. You can see the contrast right here with this dark line that highlights the outside. Just a row of slightly darker colored interior wall blocks going up the middle. That'll catch your eye. And then here we have the catwalks with the walls pointing outwards, just as a little bit of extra, once again, something for your eye to catch on to. Some interior pillars going between some jutting out just blocks to hold them. And so what you could do for a space like this is just cut it up into sections. You make some kind of detail module like this, and then work your way up. Like, just cut it off right here, finish off this part, and then move on to the next part. After here, I added the same thing that I did down there. I just made it smaller. I added the same thing once again. This one runs all the way up. Moving into the middle, I just created a little bit of depth difference with these half slopes, and then the vertical windows for some texture difference. And then moving up again, I'm using the same stuff I used down there, just in a slightly different orientation, or I guess combinations, until I got to the top here. So sparingly use these ground down wheels to look like some kind of piping, and then these are actually just ground down hydrogen thrusters with some ion thrusters. I was going for a satellite dish kind of look. And I've really kind of repeated these patterns going around the sides. On this angled side, since you can't do much for angled blocks. I've gone with the kind of the angled extended interior pillar, and then just using color differences to help accentuate. I'm using ramps right here with a darker color, so trying to get a 2-for-1 on the contrast there, and then a couple more of these tires. But since I'm limited in the kind of blocks that I can use on this base, then I'm going for a lot more color contrast, a lot more depth contrast than I was using over here. Just trying to make use of the tools available to me. Underneath the hangers here, it's basically just like blast door central. You've got the flat side of the blast doors going along with the side of the blast doors, and then using those interior pillars with the jutting out blast doors again, using the long line of interior wall again. And you can see that all of my lines are once again going with the longest side of the hanger to kind of accentuate the shape. Just flipping around the blast door to the other side gives you a nice texture difference with a couple of ground down solar panels going on there. Here's a couple beacons for some nice effect, and then once again more blast doors. If I was going back now looking at this, I would probably make these a darker color just to get some of that extra contrast, since this whole thing is white and you don't really need more white. So I would say that looks better. On the top, going a little bit more subtle with just more interior walls and spacing them out like this. If you just made one huge thing of interior walls, that would get kind of overwhelming. So definitely, you know, a little discretion and less is more sometimes. Underneath, I might have gone a little bit too far. Here's those interior pillars again, and using the tires. I actually found a use for some ground down gravity gens on this one, but there's the beacons. Beacons work really well as kind of the tops of bridges or towers, as kind of an antenna array. These next ones we won't go into quite as detailed as that one, but you can see the main theme on this one was blast doors, using them in the recesses of all the ribbings, and then using the ribbing itself, creating that depth contrast made a really nice effect. On the top here, you can see this enormous flat space, and all I did was make a darker, literally a square going around, and then making two made it look more interesting. But just by adding a couple lines on the top makes the whole thing look better. Moving over to the kind of citadel part, you've got more blast doors, you've got the vertical windows in there. That really makes this central just plain Jane armor block pop because the rest of it is lower. And then up on top, that depth really comes into effect when you start playing around with the shape of blast doors, and that is very fun to look at. This one is a hanger, and something I want to mention now is you'll notice that there's no really right angle corners. The sides of the hanger are all sloped here. The whole shape of the hanger is sloped. Everywhere you look, instead of having, I'll just place a block, instead of having like a singular right hand corner, kind of like that, I'm always adding extra slopes to make the shape look more interesting. Even on these little hangers themselves, adding these 2x1s to avoid having just a flat square, because flat squares are your enemy. Those are the things that you want to attack. There was a space right here, big, flat, and white, so I just cut it out, adding in some of these tires. That makes it look better. And then here's another example of what I was talking about for the interior pillars. You've got these jutted out kind of support stanchions for this thing. And this was one of the last things I added. I was flying around and it just kind of hit me. You just add these pillars across and all of a sudden it just looks way better than if they weren't there. Going around to the inside of this one, you can see once again avoiding square shapes. We've got these 2x1 slopes coming around here, and then the ceiling is kind of curved down in the middle. All of the hangers themselves have these extra ribbings to basically make your eye think that this is an octagon and not a square. And then you can see I'm using the top side of those interior walls as the pathway here, because it has that uniform surface and you can look at this and be like, okay, I'm supposed to walk on these gray areas. And the rest of the, basically the rest of the floor is just for show. Adding a couple of vents down on this lower area because, once again, attacking the flat space, we had this large dark area and you just want to make it that much more interesting. So trying to back out of the door here. On this one, the idea for it was to be not symmetrical at all. So a little different than what we've been going with before, and really random in the kind of detail to add. But here's those parachute blocks. We've got some half wall covers just acting like little extra bits of depth sticking out. And then moving up, here's those spotlights kind of painted a rusty brown to look like some kind of a power module with these tubes going up and down. An extensive use on this one was differences in color to create detail. You can see just using 2 different colors on basically every single part. That just makes everything much more interesting to look at. And at the top here, using those spotlights once again, while creating a couple of depth contrast going around the outside with these ribs. The game works really well with ribbing, using that depth, so that's something that you can incorporate to most of your builds. Over here on this station, to point out really quick, just drawing this pattern, creating that color contrast on the top, made the whole thing look a lot less flat, a lot less plain. It gives the top of it kind of a richness. And then I wanted to kind of draw your eye to the bottom here. Once again, using the blast doors, and it's really a simple thing. I just use blast doors and then I cut out, what are these, 8 blocks, and just put normal blocks there. But the depth effect that you get, the contrast there, makes it look great. And then you add in just a couple of, these are supposed to be kind of, those sci-fi hanging antenna wires or so. Just add in a couple of those, and when you layer it all together, you can look around at this thing for quite a while just trying to pick out those extra details. And highlighting right here, the opposing ion thrusters looking like some kind of a power module. That is an eye catcher as well. So that's it for the large grids. We will transition now to some small grid. So starting off here, I want to highlight more paint detail and kind of this paneling effect that I've gone with here. And this is actually really simple to do. I'm going to demonstrate it right now, but all I've done is grabbed basically 3 shades of gray. I just take my base shade, so you can see what this looks like without any of that done to it. The shape is nice, but it just doesn't have the same kind of depth. So you just take your base color. I'm just going to move the value down you know, maybe 5%. See how that looks. And then basically in kind of a pseudo random fashion, I'm just going to start adding extra little bits of this darker gray paint to the sides, to the corners, just wherever it seems like it would look nice, usually doing only half of certain spots. And with the first darker shade you do, you kind of want to do slightly bigger areas, and then as you get darker and darker, the areas become smaller for you to use. So this looks pretty decent for the first set, and I can always go back later. So now I'll just take my color, knock it down maybe another 5 or 6 degrees, and then do the same thing. I don't like this pattern right here, so I'm just going to make that a darker color instead. And then going into other spots or right next to those spots that you already painted, you're going to start adding these darker colors. And really just as you go, you can kind of see where your paint needs to happen. And basically how it's meshing with the rest of it. But to be honest, you can almost just point your thing at a random spot and start clicking away. That triangle right there is very distracting, so I'm going to add some more. I'm actually going to paint all 4 of those because that looks better. But now this makes another triangle right here, which I don't like. So actually, I'm going to change that. So you'll have to be doing a lot of that on the fly if you don't like how it's looking. But otherwise, and that really only happens with these more angled blocks. So once again, over here, I would switch that one back and then go back to my dark blocks and continue painting. But you can see just by doing that, we end up with this. And it's really not hard to do. It's kind of, you have to be random with it for it to look good. Coming down here, looking at these blast doors, I will also, don't want to do that side. Turn off symmetry. I will also paint the blast doors all dark because they already give that depth contrast. So I want to give them a color contrast as well to really make them pop out. And then something like this, which is already sticking out, maybe I'll highlight it even more with these guys, giving it a little bit extra. You can see this big flat space right there. That is what we are trying to avoid. So turn symmetry back on. I'll add maybe those and then go back to my other gray, come back in, see what's needed. I can add it like that. I actually think that one might be better. My original ended up doing something like that. Really, in the end, whatever you do, you kind of just end up liking or sticking with. But that technique can really be used for any color. You just dial back the value a little bit and then go crazy all over the place just to give your color a much better depth. And you don't even need 3 colors. Looking at this guy, all I have is this teal and I have gray. And so I just made a slightly darker teal, did those extra colors all over the wings, all over that, basically wherever there was teal, and then did the same thing, if I can see it in the shadows, I did the same thing with the gray, giving it that depth. In the wings, just a couple of blast doors to give it a little bit of that depth contrast, but I didn't put on so much detail into the wing that it didn't look smooth, that it looked kind of out of place. I just gave it enough so that if you backed up a little bit, the whole thing is just interesting to look at. This one right here is a much more subtle effect. You can see that this gray is different from this gray, is different from this gray, is different from this gray, and probably this one too, and so forth. So at first glance it looks like just a gray truck basically, But getting up closer, maybe I could have even done more contrast here. But it does, you know, the closer you look, the more you see. It's that kind of thing. Here we're starting to see these 2x1 slopes that I was talking about, where I stack them in this kind of a fashion. And when I back up from this, those are the things that really pop out. They look kind of like an exhaust vent or some kind of, I don't even know what they look like. I just like them, so I put them on there. I've mentioned these before in a video. These are interior lights that are clipping through the back side of half blocks. So you can see that I'm sloping down right here into a half block, and then the interior light is on the underside and it's poking through the back. That one was fun to add. And then here's those blast doors, using the flat part, using the side part to make this look kind of like it's reinforced, just giving, you know, color and depth contrast right there. And then once again, avoiding squares. I've got sloped in on these walls. On the top, it's all sloped. On the back, if you look, sloped. And then on the back here, we're sloped and sloped. You want to avoid flat squares. That is common across basically all builds, unless you're making a board cube. Looking right here, just to highlight, here are those opposing ion thrusters. Once again, I added a spotlight in the middle of this one. You can kind of see through this, so it's best to have just plain flat blocks in the back, but I didn't have space. But I really like the look of that as kind of a power module. Once again, I added it on the top, and then the color pattern, same as the Stormwalker. This guy looks a little sleepy, so we'll bring him up. And looking at this one is highlighting the half blocks. So creating some raised portions, getting that, you know, say it again, the depth contrast. And here's blast doors that kind of look like some kind of radiator vents. Really dark, really good contrast with the white of the ship. And then you can see right here, I've just got a slightly darker gray. It's not super noticeable, but just adding a couple extra shapes and lines makes that part less, basically just less boring. And then some extra vents in here that are a little bit different color, evenly spaced out. That's one thing too. You want to keep track of, you know, how many blocks go in between these, because your eye will pick it up if they're off by a block. But just highlighting that there and avoiding those squares. Everything is sloped. Doesn't have to be super sloped, but just enough so that it doesn't look like a flat plane. Once again, the tubes on the spotlights, and these ones are halfway embedded into half blocks. That gave a really nice effect. I was really happy with how that one came out. Using these 2x1 slopes once again. Then for this one, use of the negative space. So you remember these half block slopes in this kind of orientation, so that when you back up, all you see is the shadow, really. I also used it, sorry, I'm moving back and forth so much. I also used it up here by the head to get that shadow effect. And then on this part of armor right here, just using that negative slope space. Really fun. Here's some more parachutes, random hinge blocks, some more tubing for the spotlights. This one, though, I used a lot of tubing going back where it looks embedded. It's great where it's behind a couple of blocks and then going into other blocks, so that it really gives kind of a more convincing effect that way. showing off the difference in the gray colors just to make, once again, the depth of the color look better. Half blocks on the side. And what do you notice on this one, or at least what I notice, is this back part looks very flat. I made this one quite a while ago, and I would probably try and change something on this part. Maybe just adding, you know, something as small as a couple, just some single half blocks like that. You know, I might even experiment with adding these on the side just to see how it looks. I'm experimenting all the time with shapes just to try them out, just to see if maybe I like something more. I'd probably get rid of it, kind of like that. But just having those back there, maybe you could put some lights on them so they look like little engines. One thing you can use for small blocks that you can't use for big ones is the small cargo container. The sides that don't have the yellow conveyor port, they actually make for some great detail. So I will use those as well. Here's those spotlights again. Here's the parachutes. Some different shapes with the blast doors to make this part look nice. There's that ore detector. And then with this being really light colored armor, going with that negative space contrast right here on the legs, making it look good. Stacking the blast doors to look like a ribbing effect. And then here we are combining raised, so like depth contrast, color contrast, basically surrounding just these two cargo containers with this green and making it raised up. All of a sudden it becomes like some kind of a module, and you know, kind of completes the whole look down there. That's what I've got for adding detail. I hope you found this informative and grabbed at least one or two things that you'd like to try adding to your builds. But I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say contrast, and my voice is shot anyways. So I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.